to take a moment to talk about our sponsor, Alt21, the foreign exchange and hedging platform that saves you time and money on cross-border transactions. As a CEO, there are days when my calendar feels like a never-ending cascade of decisions, meetings and problems to solve, days when I can't remember if I've eaten lunch. The last thing I have time to think about is currency exposure. This is where Alt21 can help by taking the complexity out of foreign exchange. With their FX and hedging platform, you can lock in exchange rates and automate payments, and with their low fees, up to 90% less than competitors, you'll save money while freeing up your time for what really matters. If you want to stop juggling and start focusing on growing your business, head to alt21.com. That's alt21.com to find out more. Hello and welcome to Enter the Boardroom with Nurole, the podcast exploring what makes great boards and board members. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of Nurole, the board search specialist and market leader bringing science to the art of board hiring. Today's guest, Professor Alison Taylor, is a clinical associate professor at NYU Stern's Business and Society program and the author of Higher Ground, How Business Can Do the Right Thing in a Turbulent World. She holds several advisory roles, including with sustainability nonprofit Business for Social Responsibility, Venture ESG, Pictay Group and KKR. Alison is also a member of the World Economic Forum Global Future Council on Good Governance. Alison, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Oliver. It's a delight to be here.
So I first came across you at a talk you gave at the Institute of Business and Ethics, and what really grabbed my attention when I heard you speaking was how articulately you captured how difficult it is for organisations and CEOs today to do the right thing in the current environment. For those who haven't had the benefit of hearing you or reading your work, can you briefly summarise what you see as the key challenges facing boards today who want to be good businesses, why that matters, and how your thinking has evolved since you first wrote on this topic?
I suppose the neat way I put the problem, or the way that I would argue that it has never been such a difficult time to run a business, is that stakeholder expectations of the problems that a business should take on and resolve are elevated, more elevated than in the past. We expect businesses to do things about climate change, inequality, diversity, nature, etc., etc. At the same time, we seem to trust business less and less to deliver. So I think there's this paradox of inflated expectations and diminished trust. And then if we're going to get into that fraught topic of doing the right thing, what do we even mean by doing the right thing? And the other thing I would say is, from an internal governance perspective, there are really three separate conversations. So there's a sort of ethics and compliance conversation, don't break the law, have policies and procedures, a whistleblowing function, etc., etc. There's a sustainability conversation, do something about climate change, human rights, saving the world. And then there's a sort of HR culture conversation. How do you get people to feel motivated and included and have purpose and belonging? And I think one of the things that's really difficult is those three conversations happen in separate silos. And what organizations really need is a way to bring those conversations together and have a holistic view of what to do and not to do. But because we have this history, I think, of kind of siloed delegation around these various areas of doing the right thing, if we want to call it that, I think it's quite hard to think in an integrated way. And of course, at the board level, those tensions really show up.
One of the things that's been interesting to me is that for decades, organisations have consciously avoided polarising issues, and increasingly they've been expected to speak up on them. But I'm now seeing arguments that organisations should be silenced on them again. Most recently, Pamela Dow in episode 110, who was responsible for the then UK's government review into inclusion at work, made that case. Why are expectations changing so quickly, and what do you see the implications for board members?
Yeah, so I'm dialing in from the US. I think there is a very particular story in the US about polarization and taking stands. An example we could give is that there was a police murder in the upper Midwest of a teenager called Michael Brown in 2014. At that time, CEOs had nothing to say on the topic, did not consider it particularly business relevant. As we all know, by the time George Floyd was murdered, another police murder in the upper Midwest by 2020, at that time, every CEO had a comment on the issue. And so I think the Overton window around this topic really opened up between around 2014 and 2020, partly a consequence of social media, partly a consequence of increased polarization, partly a consequence of more stakeholder expectations of what a business should take on. I think after that, the tensions in trying to represent your company and speak up on behalf of your company became more present. So then we had Russia, we've had Israel and Palestine, we've had debates, for example, over abortion. So I think now it is becoming clearer to leaders that taking a stance on these polarized topics may be a problem. But I think the other thing is, and this may be a particularly American point, the country is increasingly polarized to the degree we have red brands, and blue brands. So what I'm seeing right now, and I don't know how many of your listeners are following, for example, Target, who is being, really under scrutiny on DEI, even though many other companies did exactly the same thing. There's been a drama about the Cracker Barrel logo in the past few weeks. Probably people remember the Bud Light story. So now I think what you're increasingly seeing is brands and companies being attacked by constituents who are quote unquote on their own side and who feel betrayed. So we're also seeing infighting among the polarities. And so I think you may be able to reclaim that neutral, balanced middle ground if you didn't make a really aggressive stance on one or more of these topics. But if you've already made a commitment, as Target did to DEI, if you already put your whole brand behind it, it's pretty hard to back out and say, we're going to go back to being politically neutral. And I think one of the prime challenges is here that we talk a lot about reputational risk, as if it's a linear accountability mechanism, as if bad companies get punished in the media and on social media in proportion to what they actually did. And the way I would put it is that reputational risk is in fact far more of a funhouse mirror. And very often it is the companies that are leaders on a particular topic that are getting the most scrutiny and getting the most attacks more than companies that are trying to keep their heads down. So it's a really, really difficult topic, I think.
So what is, for a board member thinking about steering their organisation to take a view on how to position themselves on some of these issues, what's your sort of best counsel?
I think one of the things you can do is to focus on topics that are directly relevant to your business model, and then even more to focus on topics where you have legitimacy and leverage. I will give you an example. Pepsi has just restated its sustainability goals. It has dialed back on some of them, for example, climate change and plastics, with the view, and I'm not saying that Pepsi isn't responsible for some failures in this area, but there's only so much a single company can do, either about resolving the failures of the Global Plastics Treaty or about climate change regulation at the global level. At the same time, Pepsi has doubled down on regenerative agriculture, which is an issue where it has direct leverage in its supply chain. So I think what I'm seeing all over the place, and there are many, many other examples, is a little bit less, we're going to go out there at Davos and promise to save the world and make big picture commitments to balancing the interests of our stakeholders, and a little bit more, where do we have direct action? Where can we drive change with our business model? Where can we actually make strategic commitments we can see through? And I think that's part of the new, mood and tone around corporate responsibility and sustainability.
Which I guess feeds nicely into your 9-question list that you've shared on how to help organisations think about whether or not they should weigh into a topic, which, when I read that, feels like a list that every board member should have in their back pocket on any discussion around this. Is it as simple as that in your mind when evaluating whether or not to get involved as an organisation?
It is not as simple as that, and the 9 questions you reference are also in, as well as in my book, in an article in Harvard Business Review called Corporate Advocacy in a Time of Social Outrage. I think the questions will guide you if you are thinking about a new issue. I don't know that they will help you if you have a history of speaking up on an issue and if you have already positioned yourself in a certain way. So I'm working with a lot of companies that made commitments either to their employees or to particular principles in the past. These were commitments that were made perhaps during the Biden administration or when things looked a little bit different, and now those same companies perhaps have enormous US government contracts, aren't really in a position to push back on some of these issues. And so I absolutely wouldn't want to oversimplify these questions or suggest that they're not extremely fraught and involving a lot of very, very difficult trade-offs about what different stakeholder groups want and expect.
So where do you see boards most commonly getting it wrong in the current stakeholder environment?
I think one thing, which is not a new thing, is the idea that ethical questions can be delegated either to the ethics and compliance team or to the HR team, while the board focuses on more strategic and exciting questions. So the first thing I would say is that ethics is now a strategic issue, is now a geopolitical issue. We've seen the dissolution of the 20th century Western neoliberal consensus to the degree that ever existed. But, there were comments around 2000, Francis Fukuyama, it's the end of history, we're all going in a certain direction. We're clearly not in that world anymore. So I think the first thing I would say is ethics is seen as a procedural process policy question and not as a core strategic question. I think the second thing I would say that is maybe a big mistake is not fully considering the cost of inaction. So easy to think it's really fraught out there, it's really difficult out there, we'll just be defensive, we'll just keep our heads down, we'll try not to make any trouble. And I think there is perhaps maybe not a full realization of if you do nothing and you stick your head in the sand, you may be exposing yourself to more risk than might first appear.
So can you bring that first one to life a bit, that ethics is a strategic issue? What is a topic that might get delegated by a board that you think shouldn't be?
I suppose one really obvious question is, can I enter this market? Can I operate in this market and adhere to the commitments that I have made, perhaps on anti-corruption or human rights or something like that? There is, I think, one example would be many companies entered Myanmar in around 2014 after the economy liberalized. There was then a coup. Pretty much everybody pulled out of Myanmar on human rights grounds. That caused female unemployment to skyrocket, and I think really questions about whether there was a net positive improvement for human rights. But I can certainly see why a company could pull out of Myanmar because there's reputational and human rights exposure. So I think those kind of geopolitical questions, there are questions about, there are issues of companies being trapped between the expectations of European and Chinese consumers, for example. There are questions of, how risky is this market? What's it going to do to my ESG profile? There are certainly questions right now about where and how to operate in the US while also adhering to commitments you've made in Europe, either to investors or to your stakeholders. So we had this dream, expressed by the Business Roundtable in 2019 that the key was to balance the interests of our stakeholders and provide value for all our stakeholders. I think it's now much clearer we're in an era of really sharp and uncomfortable trade-offs. And I think I see a lot of boards and a lot of C-suites thinking they can avoid that, or thinking they can still put out some neat messaging that will resolve these tensions. And I think that is no longer the world we're living in.
You've advocated for a shift to a more human impact North Star versus a legal North Star for organisations, where simply to do the right thing legally was okay. And as I was reading that, I was reading another book at the time on successful family businesses that have succeeded over multiple generations, and it struck me that actually they already do that. I'm curious to hear to what extent you see this as an issue that is specific to big multinational listed companies versus a universal one.
I mean, I think the problems are particularly acute for big multinational listed businesses. They are expected to disclose a lot. They are exposed to a lot of risks. They are also, of course, driven to quarterly reporting and short-term financial results. Family-owned businesses are more shielded, for better or worse, than market forces. From market forces, I'm quite often asked about, is it better to be a private family-owned business? And it depends, right? Mars is a family-owned business that's very human rights and sustainability forward, but Koch Industries is also a family-owned business that is less human rights and sustainability forward. So you have more leverage, you have more leeway if you're a private family-owned business, and you usually have been around a long time, so have a core purpose and reason for existing that may be lacking in the public company context. But I think there are pros and cons to being private and not so heavily scrutinized. So it's not so simple as saying all family-owned businesses are better and more purposeful.
And how much does that time horizon factor in to this question of doing the right thing? Because it strikes me that that's one of the big differences between those listed and private entities is, family businesses looking through multi-generations can look out 50, 100 years, and therefore you can have a very clear sense of what the right thing for you is, and you obviously might have to take a position, versus if you're having to respond to shareholder responses on a quarterly, monthly, real-time market basis, it puts you in a very different problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. And so then you see these kind of, I don't know about looking out and knowing what's going to happen. I mean, most of the people I speak to don't know what's going to happen next week, and that's fair enough. But I think having a kind of core idea and purpose and mission is a really good idea. And then a topic like climate change or inequality or democracy will become into the fore if you're thinking long-term enough versus chasing quarterly results. Paul Pullman, the former CEO of Unilever, is famous for declaring he wasn't going to report in a quarterly way as soon as he took over as CEO. So there's something valid about the time horizon and thinking about sustainability and responsibility. That said, Philip Morris is 150 years old. ExxonMobil and Chevron are companies that think extremely long-term because they have to. Amazon is a business that said to its shareholders, we're not going, initially we're not going to make profit for you for 20 years while we corner the market. So again, I wouldn't say it's like public companies bad, family-owned companies good, or short time horizon bad, long time horizon good. I think anyone running a business, the problem is not that you can't think long term. The problem is always balancing the short term and the long term.
Okay, so I guess, if I summarize that, my sort of reflection is doing the right thing is complex. There's an interesting case that I came across, which was Ritter Sport, the German family-owned chocolate manufacturer, who has continued selling into Russia, but has stated that it'll donate all its profits to humanitarian causes, and argued that they need to support the families of the cocoa growers and protect jobs in Germany and maintain the financial stability of the company. But they've suffered a huge amount of backlash from consumers saying, you're funding this war indirectly. Imagine I'm a member of the board coming to you for advice. Alison, what do I do here? How do I steer this challenge? What would you suggest?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good example of the sharp trade-offs I was just talking about. And this is not the only consumer goods company that made that call to stay in Russia and perhaps sell a more limited amount of product. So where I would go in conversation with a board member on this is, first of all, the company's human rights commitments. Has the company made a commitment to UN business and human rights frameworks? those require you to think about the human rights violations you are causing versus contributing to versus directly linked to. That is not a formula. I think a prime weakness in UN business and human rights frameworks is that the argument is if you hit an issue where you are exposed to government violations of human rights, you're supposed to go and negotiate with that government. That is not going to work in the cases of either Russia or China. So I think there is a defensible human rights argument to say that, Russian consumers still deserve to be able to buy things. It's an authoritarian state. They didn't elect this person. There is also an argument to say, the risks are too high, but I think, the reaction you describe is a company that is thinking very much about its direct stakeholders and the livelihoods and the human rights of those direct stakeholders. I think as long as you articulate a coherent argument, I think it may have been defensible to stay in Russia. The other thing, that is very inconvenient for a lot of Western companies is that many of the companies who pulled out sold their businesses to local oligarchs. We've created a new generation of oligarchs. Again, not clear this is net positive for human rights. I think the point I'm making is you can make decisions that appear, if you think about first order consequences, to be either ethical or unethical. It's very hard to predict the second order consequences. What you need is a set of clear, comprehensible principles that you can actually explain, and some idea that you've done this analysis and you've made conclusions accordingly. And so this is not the only consumer goods company that has stayed in Russia. There are questions about how big the Russian market is, but there are much more profound human rights questions. And I think the thing to say is that these kind of decision-making human rights frameworks will only get you so far. You're still going to need to make a very, very tough call.
There's also the financial element to it, which is clearly important to them, of staying afloat. How do you see those different points being best pulled together in a discussion? What have you seen? How does one evaluate the sort of the merits of either of those at a board level discussion in a way that doesn't simply come down to a personal opinion?
The company needs to stay in business or it's not going to be doing any good, right? So I think maybe the most difficult thing is weighing commercial logic and ethical logic. It is very, very easy to sort of say there's nothing we can do, we just need to make a profit. I think what you need to do is really kind of consider your long-term social license to operate and what will happen to that if you are seen to be shifting in the breeze every time that there is a new force coming up. I think that is the prime problem that corporations are having in the US right now, which is that whatever you think of the ESG, DEI pullback and debate, it is not necessarily the most sensible signal in the world to show that you believed in DEI, you thought there was a business case for this, you made a huge headline commitment to this less than 5 years ago, and you've suddenly now decided it's not a good idea because of the legal and reputational risk in the other direction. Not to say these legal and reputational risks aren't real, but I think the appearance of we will adhere to whoever is in power this week and say whatever they need to hear is not a particularly trust-building look for corporations. There was a new survey out of Gallup yesterday showing that only 54% of Americans now believe in capitalism, and a lot of ire aimed at big business. So I think we need to take that collapse in trust in big business seriously.
Many board members quietly worry whether they're contributing enough. Nurole Plus gives you expert, tailored support to build confidence, refining your value proposition, helping you build a position on key board issues, and connecting you to more rewarding opportunities. Visit plus.nurole.com to learn more. Let's go on to a second example where I want you to imagine that you're on a board where you're being asked to respond to an internal scandal about some alleged impropriety, and there have been a few infamous cases recently allegedly at Astronomer and Nestle. Imagine that I'm on a board of a large publicly listed company. I've got wind that the CEO is having an inappropriate relationship before the news has broken, and again, I'm coming to you for advice on how should I think about how to respond to this as a board member.
The first problem I would have with this scenario is you said this person's got wind, so that sounds like it's not the CEO coming to the board and saying, I want to have a romantic relationship with a direct subordinate, they want that too, which can happen, it's not always abusive, right? So let's get this person out of my direct reporting line, let's manage this, let's think about how to communicate it. This sounds like somebody who thinks they're going to get away with it because you've got wind of it. I read hundreds of papers from MBA students about real world ethical dilemmas every year. The single dilemma I read about over and over and over again is leaders acting as if the rules don't apply to them. There are principles, there's a code of conduct, there are ideas. You do not, date your co-worker or date someone in your direct reporting line. If what we have is a CEO acting as if those rules and those codes only apply to his workforce and don't apply in the C-suite, I think we've got a credibility and a culture problem. So, I'm European, I may be more relaxed than a lot of Americans about this question of, office romance, but I think the broader issue is, do you have a leadership team that believes that they are subject to a different set of principles and expectations than everybody else? And I think that is highly dangerous. So not saying the topic of office romance is easy, certainly seeing many CEOs being removed, I think, for other sorts of underperformance, and this is just an excuse. But you want transparency, you want disclosure from your CEO, you want to be able to resolve this. And in the scenario you presented, I'm not hearing that that's the case. And so therefore, I think you have to take some action. But Coles is a very good example of the romance also included a lot of commercial conflicts of interest. So you would want this issue properly investigated by people that have a direct line into the board. This is why compliance officers want a direct line into the board and not just the C-suite. And you would want to get ahead of this issue so it doesn't look as if you've been caught out. So whether you need the CEO to resign, I think, would depend on the specific circumstances. But at minimum, you need to resolve this relationship from a kind of commercial or organizational standpoint. And as we're seeing, many CEOs and many boards failing to do this, and then you have a dismissal and a scandal, and that's hugely more damaging than taking proactive action.
And where do you think that line should be drawn for board members between what goes on in someone's personal life, if it's not affecting the day-to-day of what they're doing in the business life? Because it strikes me that line has started to blur somewhat with the level of scrutiny and what you've talked about, where the personal has become public.
One of the things that's very difficult today is almost like a CEO's become like being an elected official, in that you need to have this kind of perfect track record, perfect profile. This is a problem because I think a lot of the time when we're looking for CEOs, we want a set of traits that don't necessarily exist in the same person, right? We want risk-taking and creativity and vision and charisma. At the same time, we want kind of responsibility and rule following. And I think we need to kind of acknowledge that there are maybe tensions between these two imperatives. So, I think maybe we need to get a little bit more realistic about what we're expecting from human politicians and CEOs. But your wider point about what degree you should be able to bring your whole self to work and what degree you should be able to have a private life feeds into a lot of policies that directly affect employees. Are you surveilling your employees online? Are you checking their keystrokes? Are you checking whether they're at their desks? What are you saying about social media policy? Have you banned your employees from... I think it's probably valid to say that an employee can be fired for saying something on social media that directly violates a code of conduct. But Are we saying that you can't have political opinions, you can't express political opinions, you can't express opinions about what's going on in the world? I think many boards and C-suites wrestling with this right now, specifically over the Middle East, but it is far from the only issue. And so I do think with that kind of late 2010s, early 2020s idea that the professionals become personal, bring your whole self to work, say anything in the office you'd say at home, I think that went too far, personally, and specifically because I think it gave young people the impression that anything they do or say at work will be tolerated and indulged, and managers are able to kind of, be infinitely flexible. None of that is true. All that rhetoric about, works like a family isn't true, because you'll still get laid off if the company, doesn't have enough money. So I think there's something about kind of expectations and signaling about what we expect in a professional context that needs to come back. But whether it's social media or office romance or remote work or surveillance, let's again be clear, none of these topics are simple or black and white.
Thank you for those responses, really interesting ones. What are the most difficult and what are the most common challenges to being a good business you see boards facing?
All the kind of challenges that we've been talking about at the board level. There's just kind of, without wishing to be too tactical here, there's just kind of a bandwidth issue, Ethical questions will come up in the governance committee, they'll come up in certain contexts, but very, very often they get a tiny amount of time on the main board agenda, or you're dealing with them at the committee level, and therefore there is the risk of kind of getting siloed. So I think that's one issue, is just kind of time and capacity with the amount going on. And most boards I'm speaking to at the moment are completely consumed by a combination of AI and tariffs, right? So me bringing up all these other things that they need to be worrying about, just seems like a bandwidth issue. I think the other thing is probably conformity. And then maybe putting too much trust in the C-suite and the business to kind of resolve and address these issues by itself. So, I think the board is there to provide this kind of strategic direction. And so maybe a third weakness is we tend to put people on boards that are ex-CEOs, ex-CFOs, and maybe not so many people that have the really rigorous background in sustainability, ethics, corruption, climate change, or whatever it might be.
You touched on AI there. What are the challenges you expect boards to face on AI, or what are you seeing them already wrestling with on the AI front? What are the biggest sort of themes emerging?
I think the biggest problem right now is just kind of purely ROI. Like, nobody has felt that they are able to kind of not be in this game. There is, but the commercial returns so far on AI tools are sort of super questionable. In the US, at least, I don't know the degree to which this is true in the UK, there are very clear consequences for the job market, people hiring less inexperienced graduates. So a company needs to think through how it's going to get that kind of professional capacity from more experienced professionals if it doesn't intend to provide it. And I think, these tools are very, very immature. There are sort of easy efficiency drivers or supposedly efficiency drivers in putting them in place. But I think what they do to wider collaboration, cognition, culture, and kind of overall business success is still very, very, very much TBD. And then the CEOs and C-suites I talk to seem mainly concerned about over-regulation of AI. And I'm finding that super fascinating, because now we're seeing, I think, the kind of playing out of the consequences of what social media did to our mental health and cognition, particularly among young people. That social media was not regulated, was rolled out, maybe without a lot of thought. 10 years later, we're seeing the consequences. I fear we are heading in the same direction with AI, and it will only be after some, huge amount of risks become clear that we will attempt to manage this in a proper ethical way. So I think you need preparation. I think you need to be thoughtful. I think an acknowledgement that the tools in themselves will not do anything unless they are properly embedded in people's jobs and roles and the culture. So preparation and thought and kind of less focus on speed to market and more focus on kind of thinking and planning about how you're going to manage these new kind of emerging risks and opportunities is what is needed. But huge, complicated topic.
So if that does turn out to be the case, that AI has similar negative impact to what it looks like social media has had on young people, and I'm still waiting for the same to come out on more mature people. I mean, Jonathan Haidt obviously wrote his wonderful book, The Anxious Generation, on the impact on younger people, but it seems obvious to me that the same is happening across older generations as well. What will a board or board members wish they had discussed now with the benefit of that hindsight in your mind? What are they most likely to have overlooked?
I think that there is a tendency, it's called in sociology mimetic isomorphism. Companies copy each other. So I think there is a sort of panic at the moment about being left behind. I think I sort of answered your question already, in that I think the imperative right now is to slow down and to really think this through, and to also not rely on kind of traditional compliance and governance and risk frameworks to manage this issue. These tools are being used everywhere in real time already. They present enormous numbers of risks, enormous numbers of opportunities. So I think there are limitations of control frameworks, and then there is a need to be much more deliberate and much more thoughtful about how you deploy these tools and what role you want them to have in the organization. So I would get some expertise, I suppose. There's an interesting situation in that it was widely predicted a year or two ago that AI ethics experts were going to be the most in-demand people out there. It now seems that that is not happening, and we're just kind of barreling ahead without considering these consequences. So there's a lot of expertise out there. There are a lot of people you can consult, and I would just say slow down and consult those people.
And I guess the reason people aren't doing that is because they're wrestling. It's a bandwidth problem, as you alluded to earlier, and they feel like they're in an existential fight with their competitors.
Yeah, so, the business returns are not there. I mean, I'm someone that works in sustainability, and so the idea that people would kind of barrel into some sustainability challenge, let's say fighting climate change, with no idea of financial returns is ludicrous. Like, we're so used to having to make and defend a really, really rigorous business case in order to be able to move forward with any environmental and social initiative. So I find it fascinating that no one has any problem apparently spending hundreds of millions of dollars on AI tools without any clear knowledge of what the return's going to be right now.
It's an interesting way of looking at it. I mean, I guess the way I would rationalize that is that they're looking at, they can see an upside, that if it does play out in the way that they think it might, they can see a return on that, which is, I guess, they can replace all of their human capital with a lower cost form of digital capital, whereas there's not that same obvious upside on the sustainability. It's more about protecting against the downside.
I suppose that's true, though. Watching what's happening, for example, to the electric car industry in the US because of government policy and how far behind it's become, getting compared to China. There are competitive innovation dynamics in sustainability as well, and then the idea that we just will be able to do away without any people, and isn't that marvelous, is maybe not a winning strategy if what you want is societal trust. I think we need to find the areas where only human beings can excel. There's that quote I'm going to butcher about, machines find things that human beings find hard easy, and vice versa. We need to rediscover our humanity. I mean, that's the core argument in my book, and I would take that principle to the rollout of AI as well.
Now, I know you've pushed back on those looking for sort of best practice poster childs of people, organizations getting it right, but curious to hear what is the better mental model for boards to adopt and board members to adopt when thinking about, okay, how can we be better with navigating these ethical questions that we are confronted with?
So I suppose what I would say is you need to find a path between the minimalist and the maximalist vision. So there is a view that ethics and sustainability and responsibility is just woke or fluffy, and we need to go back to Milton Friedman, shareholder value, shut up, stick to your knitting, don't break the law. That is one idea of where business should be going right now, to which I say good luck attracting or retaining anyone under 30, and good luck if you think you never need anyone under 30, even better luck to you. So I don't know that kind of going back to these 20th century agency models is going to get us anywhere. But let's also be clear that on the other side, there is an expectation that you go out there and promise to solve all challenges simultaneously with, in a perfect way. You're supposed to be addressing, 40 issues at once, and that is also not sustainable. So I think you need to find a path through that is practical and restrained and focused, which doesn't mean you don't say anything about anything. But if you are going to take a stand, if you're going to have principles, if you're going to have a strategic focus behind one of these things, let's make sure it is truly strategic, which means, focus on 3 things you can actually resolve and that are core to your business model. Don't go out there, promising to solve issues you are not going to be able to address on your own. So I think we need a path between the kind of minimalist and maximalist visions of what a responsible business really is.
Alison, time has flown, which means it's time for the lightning round, where I'm going to ask you a short question and ask you for a quick response if you're ready.
Yeah, I'll try.
Best book every board member should read, and why?
There's a book from the 80s called Moral Mazes that is about how employees handle ethical dilemmas in the private sector in real life. The author did absolutely amazing frontline interviews, and I've never read a better book that expresses the tensions between commercial imperatives and ethics in an organization. It's an absolute classic. It's a brilliant read.
I'm very modest of you not to put higher ground on there, but I'll add that there on for you as well. What's a boardroom myth you think needs busting?
That we will have better decision making if we just advance demographic diversity and put a few women or a few people of colour on the board. Demographic social identity diversity will not in and of itself lead to better conversations and better decisions. People need to be able to say what they really think without risk of retaliation.
Boardroom behaviour that irritates you most?
I think focus on cohesiveness and risk aversion.
Most valuable board ritual?
Making sure that board members are properly briefed and properly prepared. Luigi Zingales talks about being on boards and how he'll typically get a board pack with hundreds of pages of information 3 hours before the meeting, with a perhaps deliberate effort that he doesn't have time to fully digest and ask difficult questions. So if you want people in the room really challenging you and really making you uncomfortable, you need to give them time to prepare and you need to give them direction.
Favourite quote?
My favourite quote is Kurt Vonnegut: "We are what we pretend to be, so we must be careful what we pretend to be."
Most significant professional insight?
That you can have an extremely fulfilling and interesting career by joining the dots between disciplines. That breadth is just as important as depth. And so that having curiosity and thinking in that big picture way about how to connect concepts is very, very, very valuable.
The worst professional advice you've ever received?
Lean in.
Do you want to expand?
I'm quoting Sheryl Sandberg that you can resolve questions of sexism and bias by just kind of sitting at the table and doing what everybody else is doing.
What have you changed your mind on about boards over time?
I think I have somewhat of a prejudice that we just need generational shifts in order to resolve the problems that I see with boards today. But I've had the opportunity to work with boards, and you alluded to boards in their 50s and 60s, who have been really rigorous and really thoughtful and really creative. So I think the myth I need to let go of is that this is all about refreshing in generational terms.
When was the last time you got a significant judgment call wrong in the boardroom, and what did you learn?
Where I have gone most wrong in the boardroom is letting the sort of show and tell aspect of people in the core business take over. So I'm shown a very curated, joined up story about what this corporation is doing. It looks really neat. It looks really thoughtful. What could I possibly have to query? And so I think challenging that narrative and asking for the more kind of uncomfortable questions and dilemmas right up front is where I've gone wrong. So being too trusting in the narrative that people in the mainstream business are giving me.
How are you better today as a board member than when you started?
Just kind of being beaten up by said failures has made me more willing to be difficult and challenging. I am brought into the boardroom to be a critical friend, not to kind of nod along. I think both kind of getting more confidence and building more muscles in doing this, and then also thinking through how I do this in a way that people can hear, that doesn't just sound as if I'm kind of, the ethics person creating a lot of difficulties. So I think the big lesson is to kind of present these issues and present these challenges in a way that people can hear, and to offer a path forward or a set of clear choices.
And finally, 3 things our listeners should take away from this episode if they take nothing else.
Ethics is not just about legal risk, and it's not just about reputation. It is a core strategic question. 2, you will do much better if you focus and you prioritize depth over breadth. And then 3, you cannot control the narrative. Hyper-transparency, social media, young people, the reality of how the world works means that you can't control your reputation, you can't control what employees and the public learn. And so you need to let go of that control and focus on actually building a healthy and ethical culture.
Alison, thank you so much for taking the time to share your wisdom and experience.
Thank you so much for having me and for a wonderful conversation.
If you want to feel fully equipped for board conversations, with expert guidance supporting you, Nurole Plus can help. As a listener, you get 10% off. Head to plus.nurole.com and use code ENTER at checkout.